Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you for joining us here in this superb Salle Cortot. As you know, it was designed by Auguste Perret, and it is one of the theatres designed by Auguste Perret in Paris, the other one being, of course, the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. So here you have a mix of wood and concrete, and for those of you who don't know this venue, I invite you to take a good look at it. This morning, we shall not stay on the surface. We will speak volumes about the fascinating capabilities of paper. And we shall start with Santiago Alvarez, a budding stage actor studying at the MC93 in Bobigny, with 2 introductory readings. And let's hear his stories unfold. The Baroque does not refer to an essence, but rather to an operative function, to a characteristic. It endlessly creates folds. It does not invent the thing. There are all the folds that come from the Orient, Greek, Roman, Romanesque, Gothic, classical folds, but it twists and turns the folds, takes them to infinity, fold upon fold. The characteristic of the Baroque is the fold that goes on to infinity, and from the beginning it differentiates them along 2 lines, according to 2 infinities, as if the infinite had 2 levels, the pleats of matter and the folds in the soul. Below, matter is amassed according to an initial type of fold, then organized according to a second type, insofar as its parts constitute organs differently folded and more or less developed. Above, the soul sings the glory of God by running along its own folds, though without succeeding in entirely developing them, for they reach into the infinite. A labyrinth is said to be multiple, etymologically, because it has many folds. The multiple is not merely that which has many parts, but that which is folded in many ways. Each level corresponds perfectly to a labyrinth, the labyrinth of the coextensive content of matter and its parts, and the labyrinth of liberty in the soul and its predicates. Gilles Deleuze. A paper theatre. Paper. Technical journal from the industry of paper making, 5th of January 1898. An American newspaper reports that a North American architect is building a huge paper theatre. Apparently, compressed blocks of paper are a far superior material to building stone. Perhaps paper is a much more a poor conductor of heat than brick or millstone, so paper buildings are cooler in summer and warmer in winter than any other. The paper blocks are coated with a greasy substance that prevents moisture penetration, so paper houses never get damp. The paper, which is to be used for construction, is impregnated with salts to make it fireproof and with antiseptics to keep out microorganisms. Americans claim that in the near future, only paper houses will be built. Here's a perfect eco-friendly solution for our houses. So now, we're going to meet up with Camille Bénard and Alphonse Sarthout, architects and founding partners of the ciguë agency, and they will be showing us the potential of compressed paper, which they experimented with a project for the Galerie Lafayette Foundation. Camille and Alphonse, thank you for joining us. Let's take a closer look at your world where paper is a cut above the rest. No pun intended. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful and inspiring room. So we're going to talk to you about 2 projects based around the same idea, which is research into making furniture from waste paper. The issue of waste is something that has been driving us for quite a few years. Let's just say that this project was the trigger for a series of other projects related to this topic, which have taken us right up to the present day, with responses on an architectural scale. So the project we are about to introduce to you was developed as part of a project to create the Lafayette Anticipation Foundation in the Marais neighborhood in Paris. And the commission was to create the foundation's boutique with an access from the other side, from the Rue du Plâtre. And in this project, we had a rather unusual space. It was a very long corridor, which is almost 20 meters long. And the premise was to use this space to display the work of the artists who would be in residence at the foundation, and also to display other miscellaneous objects. And there was a desire to put in place a whole system, and perhaps we can see it on the previous slide, with solid oak uprights and also galvanized steel bands. And this is really the basic system that you see on the wall. And then we had all this space in front to occupy, and we had an intuition or a hunch to look for a material that was ultimately less constrained. And we were looking for complementary expression. We told ourselves stories about papier-mâché at the time, about rediscovering textures that were more organic. You see it here. And then we started to put our finger on it. We said to ourselves, well, this could be the crux of the project. I would also like to take this opportunity to talk about how we managed to embrace experimental approaches within a commission project. It's not always easy to do so. So in this case, we wanted to secure the first part of the project so that we could say we're saving ourselves a bit of money and time to be able to explore a new concept. So here you see the central displays. We've tested a number of recipes. The exciting thing about papier-mâché is that on its own, it has so much to offer. Wood, this wood already has the lignin, which becomes a binder, and the wadding, the cellulose fiber, which becomes a structure. And that's already present in its natural state. So based on that, there is no need for additives in any sheet of paper we use on a day-to-day basis. It's just compression that will help create these bonds and the drying. So that's where we started with 0 additives. What can we achieve? And we soon came up with shrinkage difficulties. I think it's around 10%. So there was a lot of shrinkage, a lot of water used in the process of paper making, obviously, and that posed mechanical issues for us. When you face shrinkage, differential shrinkage, depending on the geometry of the object, you can have tears simply in the mass of the material and fragilities. So we started looking at ways of using additives with virtuous ingredients. We started with agar-agar to try and boost its mechanical properties. We managed to improve the behavior, yet we still couldn't keep up with the geometry. So depending on the surfaces and the differential drying, we found ourselves with real deformations that were intolerable in relation to the uses we intended for them for making window displays. There was also the big issue of the project's time frame, which was rather short. It was in the context of the creation of a boutique. So we chose to carry out this experiment within this framework and not outside of it, which also meant finding a drying technique that would fit in with the deadline for setting up shop, as it were. So these are all the first tests. We're really working with cotton wool. I really enjoyed the texts that were read earlier, especially the bit about architecture. Typically, these are questions we ask ourselves. How do we go from the sheet of paper, the Bible sheet of paper at some point, to insulation material? And why not to integral architecture like the premise of the end of the 19th century? So yes, it's true. We look at paper in terms of all of its properties, in particular the way it traps air. So it's something we always have in the back of our minds for a potential future project when we carry out those tests. So here, these are tests with agar-agar. We even tried to put the ink from the paper back inside. So you have the tests in black on the left here on the screen. They were done with India ink. And this is the distortion I'm talking about, the type of shrinkage and distortion that can occur. So here we have small dimensions. I think this is agar-agar, an agar-agar test where we've achieved a little more control. We're also testing beyond the meaning of the process itself. We're also interested in expression. So with paper, we can suddenly create our own recipes and look for slightly different expressions. There was also the premise of really using all of the paper scraps we produce. Yes, that was, well, in the agency, we have a lot of blueprints and things that we print out every day. So we end up with quite large quantities of paper. There's waste produced every day. The idea behind the project is not to replace the paper recycling structures that already exist, but there is this source of waste right here in our studio, and how do we use it? Do we use it very directly, very simply in this project? It even seems crazy to me today when I think back to the amount of paper we had in those days. You have to imagine project presentations where we would print files for 10 people because everyone, entire documents for 10 people because everyone had to have their own copy. It's that presentation culture. It was absurd. So we're slowly coming out of it, and this is great. So this project came really at a turning point. So then things got a little complicated. So we wanted to make folds together. When we start to really try to land the object and control it, we make an initial mold. The first mold is in filmed plywood, but we're really compressing the material. Yes, what I forgot to mention is that we were struggling with the geometric characteristics, and we have a plaster culture at the same time. We're also working on Rue du Plâtre, which means plaster in French. And we know that plaster has absolutely zero shrinkage. It even swells ever so slightly. When we're talking about striking a balance between drying and felting, there's very slight swelling happening. So in the end, can it become an ally in holding our geometries together a little using plaster? We also know that plaster is more resistant when the water content is right. In other words, it's better to underdose plaster with water than overdose it. If you have too much of it, the water will leave behind air bubbles, which will lead to brittleness. So we try to mix it with plaster with a minimum of water, so we're really barely wetting the fibers, but we're using compression to recreate the bonds. So we make a first mold in filmed plywood, which deforms a lot, and a second one in aluminium. We're trying to redesign it. It's a pretty little beast. You can't see it here on the screen, but you have a mold with reinforcement systems, 3 millimeters, 4 millimeters of aluminium in the wall and under compression. So the mold deforms completely. And it's just a detail, but it's to say that it's there are all the tools that ultimately provide the right shape. So the second mold is discarded, and we return to steel with reinforcement systems. You also have a system for removing the mold. Perhaps if you can show the screen, show it on the screen. Here we are on the underside of the mold. We've just turned it over, so we're developing systems to release the inner shape. It creates a hollow. It's like a pot of yogurt that is removed from the inside. So you have these screws that allow us to remove the mold. Yeah. We've just removed this counterform, and then the two outer parts can be removed like an L shape. And as Camille was saying earlier, the whole project involved research into papier, the texture of papier-mâché. When you think of papier-mâché, you think that it might not necessarily be aesthetic, a bit grey, a bit pasty. But what was interesting to us, what you see on the right here, was to toy with the idea that it was a sort of book leaf with blueprints and shredded images to create an object. You saw all the little tests where we use shredding and crushing, and in the end, we simply took the classic office paper shredding machine to create what we were aiming for, to have to still see the color, a special tint or hue. You can even see letters on the pieces of paper that remained. And that's also due to using plaster. If we were using something with more plaster additives, we'd have a paste that would completely cover the fibers on the outside, and that would be less interesting. In this case, the paper with the compression sticks and tells its own story. Here, the picture on the left, you can also see the edge and the level of detail through the compression and size of the fibers we created. Ultimately, this expression is also a little rough, and we were interested in the idea that this object is fragile. The objects were not varnished, finished, protected, or coated. There was the premise that this object could potentially decompose during its life in use. There's also something pre-industrial about it. This attitude to design where we are halfway between a craft approach and an industrial approach, and with this ability to call on expertise or know-how from different fields to create a tool, to create a mold, to create a piece. And it's all this interplay where you have to make choices at many points in the process, right up to obtaining the right recipe, where all of a sudden you're working on production, and here you have a tool for producing around 50 parts. So we tested it, we did an initial test, it was interesting, it was a bit grey, a bit dull, so we started toying with it again, and in the end, all of these variations create the distinctive look of this installation.
Ce projet, on a voulu faire perdurer.
We didn't stop with this project, we wanted to keep the experiment going. So a few months later, we were called in by Veja, the brand, in the same neighborhood in the Marais, which was where their first boutique is in Paris. And as is often the case with the experiments we carry out, it's an experiment carried out within the framework of a boutique project. So in a very limited time frame, even a little too limited, because at some point we had to make choices generally speaking, the idea was that our experiments should continue from one project to the next, and that each project, through its specificity, would influence the type of experimentation or materiality to some extent. And in this space, we wanted to continue to push the question of mixing, the question of colorimetry, and the plasticity of this material. And with Veja, the brand, trainer's brand, the starting point was the work they do on materials, on cotton, the whole discourse that is developed around that. And in the boutique, we wanted to continue that story with a material that supported the products on display. So we wanted to create a new mix specifically for Verrière using a similar technique. And it also echoes the brand's expression. Here we're going to try to lighten things up completely. We start with wording that comes from construction to bring back very wide base. And then we sourced printing offcuts from a printing factory so that we could then go on to specify the colors a bit. Here you see the pepper aspect of the material. So we're on a much lighter palette here. It's an interplay between cream, rubber, of the rubber of the shoes to the white of the leather with its slightly more pop graphics that they use for the branding. So we wanted to reflect that. We wanted to create a material that reflected their brand equity. So here you can see the final mix to achieve whiteness and a very particular grain here with this version. We were no longer working with cubes, but with large flat surfaces, large sheets, using a system of molds made of similar materials, film-coated plywood and steel IPN reinforcements. And the challenge was to decide how big the sheets would be. How could we develop this material? We had in mind to make work benches, and we were thinking about pressure, how much force per square centimeter. We'd made some stamping or tamping tools. These were steel tempers that would go into the thickness of the mold. And it's pretty easy to compress when you are working on the edges, the rims, and then all of a sudden you're on the top layer and you have to close the box, and you have to imagine the previous mold. You have to close this box, and it's hard to picture, but you have this big metal machine. It brings up a wine press or something like that, rather heavy tools with mechanical screws. We started testing screws with conventional threads, but the threading was countersunk from the very start, so we went back to using machine screws with much wider threads. So there's some engineering work in the process after all. And here we find ourselves with a tool that faces the same issues as those we deal with in construction, where we have to manage force and structural problems. So for us, there's a fairly smooth continuity happening. So here we're in the oven, the dryer. We had to get all of these plates in, 2 or 3 weeks. So we developed an oven with a blower. So that's the result of these two pieces of research. And what was interesting in this last picture, once again, the research we're doing on the expression of the material in its implementation, which also expresses how it is made, the idea of compression, of differential compression, because it's manual, and this was interesting to us. I'm sure you all have in mind the contours or reliefs that may be found on logs that have been cut up like this, and at some point, by stacking planks, we create a kind of shape. And I see a more poetic continuity here, based around the tree and wood, timber. Thank you.
L'éventail. Mouvement d'un éventail.
The movement of a fan, a gesture of air and a stirring of atmosphere between all that binds and all that slices. A sequence of wings, folds of images. In short, we are faced with epiphanies, facing what makes and breaks an image. The phrasing of desire, an accessory, fold upon fold. The fan opens and closes with your body inside, a phenomenon of appearance and disappearance, let's say for fun, an erotic and wise painting, your head cut off by the folds, missing a bit of your arm, your navel, but wait and see, my hand opens more, then closes a little, your navel is there, gone just a moment ago, and I'm still playing with your body and its shapes as I open and close the fan. I play at making and unmaking the image from fold to fold, from cut to cut, from infinity to infinity. You are this fan-shaped body, this fan-shaped landscape, this gesture of air that seeks a breath and finds the night in every beat, of fleeting visions in every beat, every shadow when suddenly it closes, a slit as thin as the two closed wings of a butterfly balanced on its body, watchful, motionless, on the lookout, ready to obey fear, to be caught, chased, seized when suddenly it flies away. And my thoughts dart to your body as you flee, butterfly to our hunting scenes, first on the list of the unforgettable, and your body whispers to my body the eternal law of the hunt, the desire to lose and find. It's the law of the folds of the fan, the folds of your body, the folds of the landscape, the folds of the garment, and the folds of the mind-brain. It's the law of the folds of life, of becoming this body that I'm chasing, that hides between one image and another. Immutable fluttering, imperceptible fluttering in the wind and camouflage. A tiny living fan. Oh, surprise, ageless astonishment. Two black eyes on grey powder stare at the moment of motionless escape and melt into the soundscape thanks to ultrasound-absorbing scales. A being silently glides by, but this shadow is a passing sentence. It escapes. The fold is a silence between two pages, the fold and the book. That's where your body slides. It's in the middle of nothingness, and wham! It's easy to cut through nothing. A great gesture of air in the nothingness, and your body slips into it. It's a central story, the story of the middle of nothingness. An absolutely crucial story, the story of nothingness in the middle. Nothingness stands between what appears and what disappears continuously, a fold of infinity and infinity along a limit, a fold between each edge beating the deep line of the between folds and suspends the fan. The hand of words opens and closes. Let's see how folds make prosody, and the fan folds and completes and folds and fills, folds and cuts and folds with a single syllable. Waves and valleys, the immense geological folds of white, the immense aquatic folds of the ocean, what I see and what I don't see, what appears and doesn't appear, what disappears and returns. Your twilight pace at the edge of the pages. It's the day when your body is the day that comes from your body. It's the day that becomes your body. Night to the range of time and space, neither day nor night, but what stands between the two, neither past, present, nor future, but what stands in their midst. A point and half an arc of circle, a body and its number, for the fan is limitless. It moves back and forth between beginning and end until it becomes indistinct and disappears. It comes and goes, and every time your body is there, in the area where the visible becomes the invisible, in the white of the sentence and the image where my hand caresses and beats, plays from memory with an imaginary accessory to bring desire to the measure of your body, to the pace of excess and of a syllable. My hand, dreamy and mechanical, divines the infinite in the movements of a fan.
J'accueille maintenant. We now welcome Tony Coombe, a brilliant design historian who has taken on the task of giving a commission lecture on paper as a design project. Immediately after his talk, Tony will invite designers Marion Pifano and Raphaël Pluvinet to join him on stage for a conversation. Thanks to you very much, to all three of you. and welcome. In March 1979, a crew from the French-speaking Swiss TV succeeded to obtain an interview with Jean Piaget, the famous psychologist who died just a few months after this discussion. Received the journalist in his office as they tried the best they could to make their way through a frightening dense jungle of papers. They had to make their way between heaps of paper. So, quite amazed, the interviewer started asking Piaget, "How long have you been working in this space?" And Piaget answered, 1929. So that was half a century before. And still in a grumpy tone, he says, "Well, you can see it, can't you?" And faced with what is almost a phenomenon of paper sedimentation, the journalist asked him if he needed this particular embrace, if he needed such disorder to work, as if these documents radiated knowledge. And there again Piaget, always a little grumpy, replied, "No, not really. That's just the way it is. And so it goes." And he said, "Paper," and I quote, "it stacks up." Piaget's post-apocalyptic office, the irrational pile of paper, is the nightmare of the pioneers of standardization, who very early on took up the issue of paper format. To put it in another way, they thought that standardization, the fact of making all objects that surround us standard object, should start with paper. The Swiss Carl Wilhelm Bührer, for example, who was behind the Welt format, which can be literally translated as world format or global format, or perhaps even universal format, an ancestor of the Noah format. So Carl Wilhelm Bührer was convinced, not least because he had the support of Nobel Prize winner Wilhelm Oswald, that from this modest element, the standardized sheet of paper would be able, through a ripple effect, through a sort of Kyrielle, to embark on a virtuous process of standardization and ultimately try to organize thought. That's what these engravings, commissioned by Emil Pirchen, said. Pirchen was a disciple of Wagner, the famous representative of the Viennese secession, the Austrian Art Nouveau. Standardizing paper means standardizing the drawer, and therefore the secretary, and therefore the shelf, and therefore the library, and therefore the bookshop, and therefore the office, and therefore the entire city. Standardizing the entire city from a single sheet of paper is not a rather crude final deduction on my part. No, it's not. The reason I'm showing you the drawing by Albert Siemer is the Bauhaus town planner, is that the great names of modern architecture of the Neujahrsbauen were directly inspired by the research carried out in standardizing paper formats, starting with the famous Ernst Neufert, who in 1936, in the first edition of his famous standardization manual for architects, which is still in every contemporary architect studio today, mentions this logic of the homothetic influence of paper on the city. I quote, "Standardized paper formats now form the basis for office furniture. These, in turn, determine the production of architectural plans." End of quote. What industry is doing to paper, Neufert wants to do it to architecture, from the smallest brick to the largest facade, possibly including the body of the new man. Neufert was in direct contact with a disciple of Bührer, the engineer Walter Portzmann, who who was responsible for the paper formats of the Institute for Standardization for the German Industry, founded in 1917, the famous DIN format, and more specifically the A series, that is A0, A1, A2, A3, A4, etc. Neufert, the architect, was fascinated by this format, which was soon to enjoy a range of applications well beyond Germany's borders, and it's fair to say that he didn't know it at the time, but an impressive longevity, since 3 years ago we celebrated the centenary of this A format. In his diary, Neufert is jealous of the founding idea of the A format, i.e. the fact that it always retains the same proportion when it's divided in two, a property that he seems to find in the floor plans of certain Palladian villas, and above all that he in turn wants to promote in the field of design and architecture. From his perspective, he associated this relationship of proportionality with an almost instinctive feeling, and I quote from his diary, "The continuous cut in two is the most primitive, the most obvious, and the simplest form of division. Even small children play with paper and cut it again." Neufert was in regular contact with Portsman as late as the 1940s, and he quotes him several times, several times in his manual, which he publishes, of course, in A4 format. As you can see here, Portsman himself founded a standard office furniture called Fabrique Norme, and he follows the logic of total radiating contamination that is the hallmark of any formatting company. That is what the ray across the image says. From A4 paper, he contaminated the whole world. I'm quoting the slogan, I'm translating, and he says, "Das Format und seine Gefolge," so the standard format and its consequences. But Gefolge can also be translated as its procession, which is quite beautiful. It's the standard format and its procession, as if behind the standardized paper there was a whole procession of furniture. In the US, where paper is not submitted to the same standardization dynamic, standardized storage systems were nevertheless patented at the same time, and these were little skyscrapers dedicated to paper, as suggested by the slogan of the Showwalker brand. These are filing cabinets and drawers containing folders, which were standardized to absorb the wide variety of formats of American paperwork, in order to avoid a paper wandering around an office in the hope of finding someone with an answer. You can hear how in this discourse that anthropomorphizes and infantilizes this material, we condemn the paper that is a bit of a wanderer, the paper that's a bit of a libertarian, the kind that just happened to be there on the floor of this office as painted by Hopper in 1940, and that the secretary is looking with a very stern eye. You understand that on both sides of the ocean, at the beginning of the 20th century, people were equipping themselves against these hordes of wild papers that would soon invade Piaget's office. When in the 70s, the Italian designer Enzo Mari decided to call his modular letter tray Sumatra, it was perhaps to echo the protruding form of the vernacular architecture typical of this Indonesian island, but also to evoke the becoming jungle of bureaucracy. The designer is called upon to channel the outpouring of ever more intense, ever more dense paperwork. So for Enzo Mari, designer paper trays, as you can see here, but also several models of paperweights, including this cast iron one on the left. As part of this program, I thought it would be hard not to talk about this trinket, which emerged massively at the very moment when printing is going to become radically modernized, at the very moment when bureaucracy is beginning to develop. In his novel, Nana, Émile Zola seized on this new craze for this object, which is a milestone, a sort of a stumbling block that even in the narrative rhythm suddenly slows down the course of one of his characters through the Parisian streets. It's, if you know the characters, that the Count Jaloux. And I'm quoting, "The Count stood in front of a stationery shop, where he gazed intently at a display of paperweights, glass balls with landscapes." End of quote. These were most probably the dream spheres produced at the time by businessman and great glassmaster Pietro Bigaglia. Be that as it may, whether it's made of glass, of cast iron, paperweights are a structuring device, the 0 degree of paper structuring, the device for stabilizing, submitting to gravity, the upheaval of the material that brings us together this morning. Whether it's a precious millefiori or a simple object, fragments of IPM beams or pieces of marble, the paperweight leaves you to take a look at Enzo Marie's collection. The paperweight allows us to show a few subjective motifs on the new industrial paper landscape. So as you may have noticed, I initially wanted to show you objects that were not necessarily made of paper, but whose form was directly dictated by paper. I wanted, through the presentation of these artifacts, and I'm going very quickly, I apologize, but I wanted to talk about the tentacular power of power. When you leave it to its own devices, it piles up. And on this point, we can indeed trust traps. When you try to standardize it, it standardizes you in turn, and you always have to follow it, always channel it, always conform it. Paper can be said to draw objects. Olivetti is, of course, an Italian firm. It has played a very important role in the history of computing, but it's also a matter of paper, a matter of negotiating with paper. For Olivetti, the great Maestro Ettore de Sas drew many models of calculators from paper, as if the instrument flowed from it, like a kind of shock wave, like circles in water. And I think the image shows it quite well. Once again, the paper radiates, the object springs from the paper, flows from the source of the paper, and even behind his 1969 Valentine, you know, the famous typewriter designed by Zotzas, so beyond its color, there is the idea of accompanying paper as a medium for mechanized writing into the new territories. It is in the process of opening up. It was paper that took to the road with Kerouac. It's paper that goes far into the landscape, on the beach, at the skating ring, on the train, or even in the cockpit of an aeroplane. So it's paper that gets as far away from the office as possible. So it's about designing for that paper too. Standardized paper flees business districts. It escapes from the gang. But let's go back, if you will, to Germany in the 1920s and to the Bauhaus. Let me remind you that the nonagerian I mentioned in my introduction was one of the very first students in this prestigious design school. And he was even an assistant to Walter Gropius. Alongside research into standardization, it was also a material for invention, a material and texture for design, and this is why paper was to be explored in great depth in Weimar, then in Dessau, then in the US, then back in Germany in Ulm. Although this material does not appear in the famous teaching plans of 1922, it nonetheless remained central to the school, never losing its importance as it moved from one place to another. A brilliant young student turned master turned teacher, Joseph Albers, was in charge of material studies for the propedeutic year, the preliminary course. You see it's at the top left, and its study of tools and materials. So that's taught by Joseph Albers. And this young professor loved provoking the creativity of his students by throwing at them this type of formula. Paper is flat. It has to cover something. Its main appearance is the plan. It cannot stand upright or be stretched. It didn't take much more than that, of course, to see rise up this type of paper structures that testify to this strategy of learning by doing, which is typical to the Bauhaus movement. This almost playful approach to creation, this point of convergence between design and play, is fully embraced in the Bauhaus movement. And this time I'm quoting the great Laszlo Molinari, who is the director of all propedeutic courses, and from 1923 he also replaced Johannes Hilton. He says, one of the most important exercises was the re-examination of the tools and materials so that the work required could be carried out according to their basic qualities and characteristics. This approach could be described as research without artistic pretension or prejudice. Research, first on a model scale and then on a larger one, is the basis for creative thinking. This idea has affinities with the play technique of the kindergarten as well as with the education of the apprentice by the old craftsman. There is, however, a major difference in orientation. Adult play, while allowing for relaxed exploration and data collection, is implicitly constructive. For these basic design courses, even after years of great shortages, Joseph Albers, and I'll get back to this, has always favored the manipulation of materials that are accessible, inexpensive, abundant, and above all, not immediately dependent on traditional know-how. So he often uses waste materials, printing offcuts, but also corrugated cardboard, as you can see here on the screen, but also cardboard tubes, matchboxes, confettis, fragments of paper, and so on. So the study of materials, through trial and error, gives rise to the design of small structures that reveal the internal energy of materials, in other words, their fundamental properties, or their intrinsic construction capacities, their possibilities, their limits, their fundamental properties, their construction principles, their technology, their particular fragilities. It's about making them appear according to their laws of contrast and affinity. That's what Albert is writing. And Albert, as you can see, kept a huge number of notes and archives from these exercises. He documented his classes extensively. And you can see here he has written notes about paper, and that's an exercise of balance, the balance which is proper to paper as a material. Then we come back to the image to the left, and these are criteria of economy, economy of material, economy of gesture, criteria of consistency with the very DNA of the material that would very often make it possible to assess the creation in a collegial way in these sessions of which we keep this beautiful image. So I quote, the syllabus, the course offered by Albert in 1929. Stage 1, free use of the material. The sense of matter is developed through free study of raw materials with no practical purpose. End of quote. So in the first step, these applications do not have any precise purpose, but they will soon have to be reinterpreted either in the field of art or in the field of crafts. I continue. Second phase, study of performance in crafts workshops and industrial companies. Particular emphasis is placed on manufacturing the materials and on the handling of tools and machines. End of quote. So as we can see from these exercises, which are from the Institute of Design, formerly the New Bauhaus of Chicago, we see that Molinaggi was directing it in the US, and we can see very quickly that these experimental cutouts were stiffened and became seats. So if the Bauhaus was reborn in Chicago in the 1930s, it was thanks to the patronage of a powerful American paper manufacturer, Walter Peck, who founded the CCA, the Counter Corporation of America, which was a firm that made a major contribution to the new packaging culture in the US and more widely in the world, and which was to center a large number of representatives of the European artistic avant-garde in his own company, since its artistic director would be Herbert Bayer, whom I mentioned before. And you see that he has a certain number of posters made by great designers like Fernand Léger. So it's important to understand that in the US, the renaissance of the Bauhaus, the fact that the torch never goes out, is very much linked to the paper industry. Okay, let's make a great leap forward now in history. At a previous edition of the Académie des Savoir-Faire, designers at Normal Studio showed that paper can be used to make up objects very easily, which can then be translated into other materials such as metal and then produced in industrial series. This Selene lamp that you can see, or the lamp reflector, which you can see to the right, and that was created thanks to metal hydroforming techniques. These two models were first made as a mock-up in paper with very simple resources, i.e. the pair of orange scissors. So for all these reasons, Albers had a particular affection for paper. He never stopped exploring this material during his migrations from Bauhaus in Dessau to the school in Ulm via the Black Mountain College and the Yale University. And actually, one of the sculpture students at Yale, he said, "Doesn't matter if you don't have a studio or if you're far from your tools, you can always get something out of paper." The teaching of Joseph Albers would go a long way towards making the propedeutic year course a necessary foundation for the pedagogy of any art and design school throughout the 20th century. At the Bauhaus, the study of material, quite mechanical, is coupled to the study of materials, which has a much more sensitive orientation. But these are two distinct courses of studies. These subjects are directly inherited from the first director of the propedeutic year, and these are more focused on the appearance, on the surface, on the texture of materials, on their reaction to light, and the combination between sight and touch that these materials involve in approaches that can be described as kinesthetic, but also, more precisely, as haptic. So once again, Molinagi said, these exercises, which are no longer about materials but about matters, are mainly based on sensory experiments made possible by working with different materials and their technology, by the skill and coordination of fingers, hands, eyes, and ears, by folding, rolling, cutting, and other manipulations of sheets of paper that lead to an understanding of the basic three-dimensional structure by visions of plane, volume, and space, and their subsequent articulation. In Chicago, for example, as you can see, Molinagi had its student make light modulars, out of paper in order to understand how this matter would receive light and how light would reflect or be reflected or absorbed by it. We can think back to some of Constance Guisset's hanging lamps. We can, of course, think about Japanese lanterns made of washi paper, which are cited as examples by the masters of the Bauhaus school. But of course, we can also think about the early research of sculptor Isamu Noguchi, who at the same time in New York led the famous Akari lamps after his trip to Gifu in 1951. And then with Nobushi began a company with Oseki, and they managed to relaunch an international market for this traditional object, which was in real danger because of the arrival of electricity in Japan. Molinagi is more directly influenced by the work of an American photographer who would deserve to be slightly better known, Francis Verrière. He uses sheets of paper whose folds and cuts are highlighted by extremely low-angle lighting to create abstract compositions. That's really Molinagi's reference. The other reference, of course, is Marinetti's Manifeste, which gave rise to Marinetti's first tactile table. But I quote Molinagi. It seems paradoxical, but practice has proved it. Alongside direct tactile experiences, the advance of photography, i.e. of an optical process, encouraged the culture of touch. And here are these direct tactile experiments. So, Molinagi started teaching in Germany and encouraged the students to question and explore the borders, as I said, between touch and vision. She created these tactile tables to explore the sensory stimuli associated with different materials, to compare paper, metal, textile, fur, etc. And this is what you can see in this tactile table, and to compare different textiles, different grains of paper, or different punches applied to the same material. So here you can see that's a tactile table with paper which is embossed with different type of punches. One of the most interesting response from a student is probably that of young Hotti Berger, who was to become a great textile designer, whose life was too short, alas. She was almost deaf, but as part of this first-year Bauhaus exercise, she created this sublime paper piano with adjustable parameters, a keyboard with interchangeable paper keys. Here you can see that she has sewn textile corners, and you can introduce various colored papers. So Hotti Berger reminds us here that paper, metal, and textile, beyond their formal and chromatic composition, are also something to be felt. Better than that, she reminds us that it's all three at once, These three aspects must be correlated. Shape, color, and tactility cannot be separated. To put it another way, this synesthetic approach was widely advocated by another of these teachers. The name was Wassily Kandinsky. So in short, as you understood, with Bauhaus, everything's been said. Needless to say, this school has established itself as the root, as the trailblazer, as an incredible incubator for design in the 20th century, and this also perhaps in the field of paper. The very early research that members of Bauhaus carried out into this material paved the way for many designers or for many design projects. So whether it be Peter Murdoch, who in the 60s set himself the challenge of being able to erect a stack of 800 school chairs that would be less than 150 meters high. So that's the unfolded version. There are also very beautiful models that are practically pages of writing, whether it be Nando, who transformed the rolls of pleated paper used by couturier Issey Miyake to texture his textile into seats by simply cutting them out. So you can see that we're thinking more and more about Piaget's cozy nest.
Now, staying within the field of paper seating or washi paper, I must refer to Tokoshin Yukiesha, which will bring standardization and customization into tension using different types of seating. The list goes on and on. I could show you a whole host of projects. I would also like to quote Frank Gehry, the great architect, who, as The Simpsons suggested, he laid out his greatest architectural ideas on crumpled paper. It's a famous sequence from The Simpsons, well, at least famous in the world of architecture. In fact, from the 1970s onwards, Frank Gehry began experimenting with what he called the pro aspect of certain materials. He admits that, and here the Simpsons are not completely off track, let me quote Gehry and not the Simpsons. One day I saw a pile of corrugated cardboard, the kind of thing I build my modules with, and I started playing with it, gluing it together, cutting it into precise shapes using a small saw and a cutter. End of quote. So as you can see, here we're no longer talking about the pile of papers cluttering up the office, but rather the pile of papers as an office itself. A pile of papers as an office space into which we try to carve, sculpt, dig, as if into a block of marble or a log of wood, alcoves in which, as best we can slide our bodies. So obviously we could talk at length about Gehry. He has produced several series. The first series I showed you is the most massive one, the crudest. In fact, it's the most recent series. The very first series is the one you see here on the picture. It's much more refined, much more subtle. It's very solid. There are plenty of very provocative images of Gehry where he managed to put a car on cardboard seats that he made, and another one where he jumps on his cardboard desk, and this was the first series in 69, 70, and 73. And then a little later in the 80s, he did the much more massive series again, which corresponds to the previous picture I showed you. What's also interesting with Gehry, he had the opportunity to furnish and wallpaper different spaces with this kind of corrugated cardboard, either exhibition rooms, as you can see here on the screen, or meeting rooms. And each time he was convinced of the great sound and acoustic qualities of this material. I hadn't mentioned this before. As far as I know, it wasn't exploited much at the Bauhaus, even though Mooli Nagy talks about sound at one point. So there you have it. We can also talk about the acoustic qualities of paper. I don't know if this has been done at other morning sessions of the Academy. So this time we're thinking more about Proust's upholders upholstered desk. We saw this earlier with ciguë. So designers often succumb to the temptation of finesse with stone. With paper, it's rather the opposite. Designers are strongly tempted to tend towards volume, to tend somewhat paradoxically towards mass. There are other examples than Gary. Think of the folding of the think of the pop-up, think of origami, think of leporello, think of pleating, think of patterning, think of the millefeuille, which again allows Nando to bring out the wood from which the rim comes through a skillful interplay of cutting, polishing, and lacquering. Here, Nando gives a nod to one of the sources of paper. Another project that is quite interesting from this point of view, in terms of the tension between mass and finesse, is the L'Étreinte collection, the Embrace collection by the designer Élise Gabriel, who has tackled a very unglamorous material, but one that is actually quite close to paper. That is Zelfo, a material that was patented in the 90s and made up of 100% of cellulose fibers. So it looks like a kind of big viscous paste or pulp, and as it dries, it shrinks by almost 70% of its initial volume. So this reduction of mass is perhaps a reminder that finesse is in the very DNA of paper, of this material, but above all, it is a dynamic that is extremely difficult to control, and it has nothing to do with the withdrawal of ceramics during firing, for instance, which is much more controllable. Let me quote the designer on that subject. Zelfo is a living material. Of course, I can direct it, squeeze it, trap it. But in response, there is always a quiver, a twist, an unpredictable contraction that goes against the grain. I watch for that brace, I look for it, sometimes I even anticipate it, and that's what this project is all about, to do and let do. End of quote. So as I said in the first part of my talk, paper is hard to control. It's a material that in a way has emancipated itself and will draw on its own. I thought it would be interesting to conclude my talk to invite the design duo, Marion Pinafo and Raphaël Pluvinage, to join me on stage to replay, in a way, a long interview we did recently, which will be published by the B42 publishing house in a few weeks' time. So it was interesting to give them the floor, to continue talking with them on their work with paper, among other materials, because it echoes several aspects that I tried to highlight this morning. It seems to me that their approach deliberately asserts itself as basic design, in the sense that there is a strong research aspect that is preserved, established, and upheld. And then, on the other hand, I don't know if you noticed it in my lecture, but whether it's Neufert with the example of the childish instinct to fold paper in half, or Morley Nagy with the idea of constructive play, or Frank Gehry just now, who starts playing with paper and cardboard, in this case lying around in his studio, paper can provoke an immediate interaction of a playful and magical nature. Think of kites, paper planes, fans. We heard the excerpt recently. Think of confetti, the blowpipe, and so on. So in a nutshell, this negotiation with the spontaneously interactive nature of paper is once again, I believe, an integral part of the work of the Pinafo-Pluvinage duet. Thus, I invite you, if you may, to join me on stage. Thank you. I would like to remind you that we see the pictures of your work here. You met in 2013 on the benches of the École Nationale Supérieure de Création Industrielle, known as the NC, and that since 2013 you've embarked on a career as a duo marked by self-published research projects and collaborations with cultural institutions and brands like Hermès. Your work is currently being exhibited at the Belle Ordinaire in Pau. It will be soon exhibited in the Saint-Étienne Design Biennial, soon at the Grand Palais, and so on. I'm sure there are many more exhibitions. You use the tools of industrial design, graphic design, and interaction design to straddle the boundary between technology, art, and education. Your work is always stimulated by scientific concepts that you try to make accessible, to convey through objects that could be described as playful, a little mysterious, magical, and festive, and that often linked to modest materials, including paper. So here we see a few images of your studio located in Rabastens in the southwest of France. And to get to the heart of the matter, we could start by talking about this project, which bears witness to your interest in the material of interaction. Since, 10 years after you met at NC, the school where you studied, you were contacted by this school, which was looking to re-edit the diploma parchment. In other words, the paper that students are given once they graduate. So, as was the case with previous designers who were commissioned to produce this parchment, how did you decide to address that and to embark on the production of colored paper at the very heart of the school? Well, first of all, you have to remember that the previous people who were asked to produce this diploma parchment were great illustrators, Moebius, Matoti, so it was hard to follow suit. We didn't have the skills to come up with the right visual. We worked a lot with paper. We didn't have any graphic design training, so we tried to find tricks around the manufacturing processes to tell a new story. And this project came about as a result of two simultaneous projects. We were completing an exploration of printing processes in ticket and passport printing, and this is an area where the processes are really pushed to the extreme to avoid copying, counterfeiting. So we realized that it was not just the printing process, but the paper processes. In other words, when a banknote is manufactured, all the stages are pushed to the extreme. If you look at a 20-euro banknote, there will be little hairs that are randomly discarded when the paper pulp is produced. So we were interested in intervening at the moment when the pulp is being produced, even though the object is ultimately two-dimensional. So we were also quite fascinated by the idea of creating a motif or graphic design in volume, in particular with the transposition of cement, where you see the motif in the very base. We were looking for an image that would cut through. We didn't want a visual that was printed. We really wanted the image to cut through and merge with the medium. So we did a lot of research into this technique. So we invented a process, you can see it here, where when the sheet of paper is being made, it's important to go through this sieve stage. We remove different parts, and, well, what we should say is that this cannot be seen on the picture, but there are little caps on the compartments. The frame is dipped in pulp, and the whole thing is covered in pulp, and the elements are taken out and then filled in with color, because we wanted a result that was even in terms of thickness, to be able to use the letter set process. So it's true that there's a lot of work involved in developing a sheet of paper that takes a long time to control, to master, because afterwards this has to go to print, so it has to pass a form of thickness standardization and cannot be totally variable. It's quite technical. So we wanted to have a very precise vocabulary of shapes, and the diplomas were then created in the school courtyard, made by students to create 250 unique copies where they would come choose the colors and materials with a fairly simple vocabulary of shapes. Do you want to go into detail about the different operations that the paper undergoes afterwards? Well, the paper goes through hot stamping, embossing. It's quite technical. These we used old Heidelberg machines, but they're still limited. There can't be too much variability, as we said, And we were able to work with a studio called Studio Pression in the town department, which is brilliant. And they agreed to work with non-standard paper. Perhaps I can show another project. In several other projects, you sought to give paper, which is in itself already extremely technical, a new technicality by using pyrotechnic inks. I talked in my lecture about the temptation to go beyond the two-dimensionality of paper. So can we consider your artifice posters from 2021 as a kind of pop-up in a gaseous state, a smoky state? Or more tangibly, can you tell us how you managed to combine fire and paper in a different way to that is at the heart of the novel Fahrenheit 451? Well, this project, as you said, dates back from 2021. We managed to finish it in 2021. In fact, we started it in 2016. And at the time, we were doing another project, which we will be talking about later, called Papier Machine. At the time, we were very purist. We wanted to imagine all kinds of effects on sheets of paper that were simply due to the use of more or less special inks or to the accumulation of inks between them. We didn't want to bring anything in as an external element. We wanted to create shows using just the inks. We ended up tampering with pyrotechnic powders to create effects. So we've always been fascinated by fireworks, the show, but also the objects themselves, the rockets. So we did a lot of dissecting, firstly to get access to the powders because we didn't have the license to buy this kind of product. So we dissected this, and we had no idea, but it's very educational. You cannot understand a show that's going to happen by seeing the stacking of powders in the tube. You can understand that by looking at it, in fact. That's what we tried to recreate afterwards. And you went to China, to the fireworks capital. Yes, that's one of the many things that triggered the desire for this project. We wanted to show the ingenuity behind the black boxes that will produce an effect, but which are usually hidden. As Marion says, we're fascinated by fireworks, but also by all the ingenuity behind them. So in this very long project, obviously it's a challenge. You make 300, 400 attempts, and it doesn't work. It's a 10-year-long project. We start again and again, and when it finally works, that's when the project becomes really interesting because we manage to get 5, 6 effects that we can print. So you come up with an impression technique, you invent it, and you get this sort of palette that's not a palette of colors, but a palette of effects. So we also need to come up with a graphic composition that comes at the same time with a choreography of sequences. So you have this interesting game, a choreographic drawing, where we have to transpose the sequence in time at the same time. It's also about continuity. We've just been working on circuit boards printed on paper, but there's the same logic here. It's really the black powder, the pattern of the black powder that we're going to follow, and that's going to disperse. Maybe you'll ask the question, why do we do it on paper? No, you don't? Why? No, I wasn't, but why are you doing this on paper now that you mention it? Well, I don't know. Well, that's another aspect of our work that's close to our hearts, and that's what we always try to do. It's a bit intuitive. We didn't say to ourselves that we were going to do it like that. It is a challenge, and as Marion says, sometimes you just want ink, you don't want to do anything else. And with paper, there was a challenge because paper burns, but we were adamant that it was really important to do as little artifice as possible, but with as little material as possible as well. And there's a technical trick. It had to burn only on the surface so that the sheet of paper and the poster still had value once burnt, and that it would remain there and wouldn't burst into flames. And here's an anecdote. This was acquired, it was bought by the MUDAC, the Design Museum in Switzerland, and they didn't know how to get the posters which hadn't been burnt to Switzerland. No courier wanted to take them. Either it was an art transport company that didn't want to transport pyrotechnic materials, and conversely. So it took 2 years of conversation to finally achieve that. Perhaps, as you mentioned, we could move on to your research into electronic ink, which once again will enhance the effects and technical nature of paper. So for this research, you had to leave the field of craftsmanship, come out of this and cross paths with a certain number of industrialists, paper manufacturers, printers, ink manufacturers, printed circuit boards manufacturers. So again, how did you manage to combine these worlds, which on the face of it are not very close to one another, do not really relate to one another? So what difficulties did you encounter? What surprises did you come across when thinking about electronic ink? Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about the background. Well, it is a 5 to 6 year long project. I think we can thank Constance Guisset. She was the director of the OG Talent Jury, which was a good start to the project. The project consisted of a notebook of paper toys with circuit boards printed directly onto them, which can be put together to create toys or games. And the idea was to immerse the play into all of the mysteries, the mechanisms that we don't see in the electronic components, and to not to really explain them, but to reveal them, to enable people to say to themselves, oh, a flip-flop sensor is just this sensor is just a little ball that can move in a groove and make short circuits. So we have a lot of sensors like that. And there were many steps. Obviously, there's the production and development issues involved in this project. There was no ink made for paper. This type of project was very difficult because of that. This ink is designed for printing on flexible PCBs, in other words, on plastic. So first off, at the prototyping stage, we had to find techniques in the workshop to bake the ink without burning the paper. And we really wanted it to be paper because it would have been easier if we'd used plastic straight away. But we really wanted it to be a familiar material to talk about a subject that could be frightening, electronics, or that people might find boring. I don't know. We really wanted to use materials that we were familiar with which we had many different habits and uses. And we used all the intuitive ways in which we use paper to find ways of interacting with it. For example, confetti, papier mâché, crumpling paper, tearing it, folding it. That gave us ideas for making this. Here, for instance, there's a circuit board, and all the confetti is black paper containing carbon. So when people throw confetti, the circuit board will recognize where there's more or less confetti, and a melody will be created, which will be different each time depending on the location of the confetti. The one you saw in the first picture, where a pellet of paper has been pulled out, that almost comes from the sensor. The source of inspiration for this project is a humidity sensor. And some of them, I think, are made of paper because the paper will become loaded with humidity, and as a result, the conductivity of the paper will increase. So these are pellets of papier mâché that are fired, and when they hit the target, which is made of black circuits, they create a short circuit and produce a sound. And this project was called the Arcade Poster, and the premise was to use paper in all of its formats. So we went from the notebook, the A4 notebook, to these large posters. And it's true that there comes a time in the project, maybe 4 or 5 years, when we're only doing prototypes, when we're producing 5 or 6 projects or copies, and I don't know where they come from. They came from, I don't know where the starting point was. We didn't think it was going to continue at all, but after the Odé Prize, there was an exhibition at the Art Deco school in Paris, and people thought that we could take off from there. And we were pushed into making it because it was an industrial challenge in itself. We were looking for manufacturers then, but nobody had ever printed a book or printed this type of ink on paper. So we started trying to get 2 different manufacturers to work together, a paper manufacturer and offset printing manufacturer, a die-cutting manufacturer in France, in Varennes, and it turns out that they don't know each other at all. There was an electronics printer who made computer keyboards and telephone keypads. They started working together, again with all of the problems associated with the fact that you cannot bake paper. And in particular one that almost brought the project to a halt, which was that when the ink was being baked, the 1 meter sheet of paper lost almost 5 millimeters. And as you can see here on the picture, all the little cuts for the components to set are extremely precise. So there were quite a few discussions between these 2 manufacturers to get the project up and running. And it took maybe 2 years of production, of development time. Several thousand copies were made. Another thing you combine in your research and final production is the fragility of paper, even if it's corrugated cardboard, and sometimes the roughness of the crowd touching your works, since your projects are often shown in institutions where for once you give permission to touch. Can you tell us about the difficult relationship between paper and the crowds?
Well, as soon as we started working, we worked on projects where manipulating by the audience was at the heart of the project. And there was a great enthusiasm that came out of this. So we kept doing it. And we realized that when you trust people, everything goes fine. The fact that it's a fragile material, people adapt their gesture. Had it been in bronze, or stone, things would have been different. But then we worked more on cardboard than paper for exhibitions. The objective, once again, is not fragility. It's just what's necessary. And that's what in some of the projects it's all about, because the effect is extremely, extremely light. That's our starting point. We imagine the project, and then we think what fascinates you at the time, and then we have the challenge. So it's not that we submitted to it, but we master it. And as Marianne said, in most cases, fragility encourages confidence. One last thing that's at stake in this marriage between palpation from the crowd and paper is also that you're very interested in the banal and very everyday character of paper. Yeah, we like to sublimate materials that are quite cheap, but we're starting to do that with wood and all that. It's a bit open, sorry. Yeah, but there are challenges. Honestly, we can't explain it, but every time there is something, as Marianne was saying, we're a bit of a purist. And I think it just comes from a sort of personal challenge that we set for ourselves. Wait a minute, could we make this? That would only work with sand and paper. So that's why that's what the project is all about. Often we could take shortcuts, but at the end of the day, we have to do it. We have to keep doing it. Okay, we now have something very serious. Thanks to Santiago, we have an excerpt from the various treatises on origami bird making. A treatise on the art of origami bird making. In fact, the raison d'etre of the paper origami bird lies in its geometric perfection, a perfection it strives but never achieves. The perfect origami bird must fit into a perfect square, and if we remember that the egg from which it emerged was a square of paper, we'll see that its perfection consists in being able to fit in its own square egg to remain faithful to its origins. From this we deduce that perfection in any being consists in always being able to inscribe itself in its generating ovum and remain within the limits of its origin. It's obvious that because of the precarious and miserable conditions of our earthly life, and given the, among other disadvantages, those presented by the material, thickness and other imperfections of papers, there are origami birds that rigorously fulfill their geometric ideal. So the divine archetype of the origami bird is a geometric species that lies from all eternity at the bosom of geometry. The closer an origami bird is to its archetype, the better it fits to a square. And this raising a very interesting and suggestive question. What makes each origami bird so individual? What distinguishes origami birds of the same size is precisely their imperfections, because if all origami birds were perfect, i.e. able to fit into perfect squares, they would only be distinguished from one another by their size and the place they occupy in space, but not qualitatively. They would not be identical, but rather the same or similar, as squares or equilateral triangles always are. So we can see that perfection is acquired at the expense of personality, and that a being is all the more perfect or archetypal the less personal he is. Let's ask ourselves, looking at these origami birds, whether it's appropriate for us to aspire to become supermen, or men capable of being inscribed in a perfect ovum. As we know that to achieve this super perfection, we must give up our personality. It's true that we've been prescribed the task to become perfect like our Heavenly Father. But perfection is like an unattainable goal to which we must only aspire. And if we sacrifice our personality on the altar of perfection, we are aiming at melting into the archetype. Because if, as some people maintain, God is my projection into infinity, our parallel lives will meet in infinity and my projection will coincide with yours. And this would be the place where all our selves would identify and merge to perfection. It would therefore be the collective me, the universal self, the all self. And don't tell me that the art of origami bird making is not a science of the very high scope, leading into sublime contemplation. We are very lucky to welcome Pietro Corraini. As you know, for years, the Italian designer collaborated with Maurizio and Martia Corraini, and they produced all these wonderful books that delighted our children and us. And Pietro came to us to tell us the story of these collaborations, of this friendship, that gave birth to all these extraordinary books. Thank you, Pietro. The floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you. I will wait for everyone to put their headphones on. Thank you, thank you. I'll try to keep to the time limit, but when we're talking about books and papers, I tend to run over anyway. So if I go over my time, just throw some paper balls at me. Listen, I'm going to try to tell you the story of Bruno Munari and how he came to work with the Éditions Corraini. These are two entities that talk to one another, that meet, that have a dialogue. Corraini was founded 52 years ago. It didn't start out as a publishing house, but as an art gallery, a physical space where artists were invited, where artists could mount their exhibitions and express themselves and evoke their point of view and take possession of the space. And it's no coincidence that Corraini is based and lives in a theatre. The publishing house is set up in this theatre, a beautiful theatre, a theatre where anyone can enter and take possession of the walls, as in any contemporary art installation in the 60s in Italy with poor art. All these artists who worked on poor art and who occupied the space, and in the end, who occupied any medium, including the walls. Over the years, my parents invited many artists to these rendezvous, including Bruno Munari. Bruno Munari began with an exhibition, and the first collection he produced was called Block Notes. These were booklets designed by Bruno Munari and Maurizio. They drew all this on their desk while talking, but this was the beginning of something. It was a beginning. And let me show you what this is about. These were the first catalogues that you can see. They were the first published by the publishing house. But let's take a step back in time. An art gallery invites artists and starts publishing catalogues. And you have this interaction between Corraini and Munari and the way of making books. Just like an artist enters or walks into an art gallery and occupies a space, transforming it, well, that's exactly what happens with books. We have little catalogues that start out telling the story of the exhibition and then change their nature, become a space that can translate outside the space, which in turn becomes spaces. So in the end, these books are products that leave their designated space to take possession of another space. These are 10 by 10 in terms of format. And then there is the Munari exhibition. And we thought, okay, let's think about a different catalogue. And here is the object that came out. It's a book. It's a book that's the result of Munari's research, who worked on non-readable books in the 50s. And so he removed everything that's usually in a book. And he shows us the book as an object stripped of its content. But it's not stripped of its content. It's stripped of its content as we see it. Because that's a book that tells things. It can be scrolled, it can be placed on a bookshelf. It's a book bursting with colors. It's made up of different types of paper. And over the years, he produced and imagined books made of extremely different and complex papers. So it's clear that Bruno Munari arrived and tried to shake up things, to completely change the game, to create a small revolution in his own way. So he comes to us, to Corraini, and completely changed the approach. Okay, I'm going to circulate the book. Just play with the books. So this invisible book is born, but that's a book that shows the book in all its power, in all its attraction, and all its force of expression. So you can make holes, you can cut the sheets of paper. all the limits of paper can be overcome. And that's something totally different from what we said up until now. So before I spoke, we talked about paper as being a material for construction. But here, paper becomes a transportation system that brings knowledge from one place to another. But it can also be projected, as you can see. So here is a whole series of prototypes which have never been published. These are images that no one has seen before you. That's exclusive. These illegible books by Munari, but you know, Munari had his brain always active, looking for new materials and new media and new ways of using a book. And you see that he's a graphic artist. He also designed books. And us, as a publishing company, we work with this wonderful designer, and then we do things differently, and we start making experiments with making holes. So this was in the 50s, and as you can see, we were always using different materials, and the production was very small scale, with very low print runs. And then there was the period when Munari was trying to apply his knowledge and skills to books. The use of paper and offcuts. It tries to get inside books. It tries to look inside the books. It tries to understand what a book really is. These are the books that we're producing. Not everything has been produced for us. Look at the notepads that you saw earlier, like the MN1. These are projects that Munari imagined with Maurizio Corraini. They met in the 80s. But Munari was already around in the 20s. You've seen the tactile tables that he made with Marinetti, but Munari was there at the time. He started with Futurism, and he really did go through all the major movements in Italian contemporary art. And these are pre-books. 12 books, each produced with different materials. One with sponge, one with fabric, another with wood, another with paper. And obviously, when you see this, you think of touch, of this tactile aspect, which is ever so present at the beginning of the 20th century. So Munari created these books to give them to children, to make sure that children are free and can spontaneously fraternize with these objects when they, just like when they play with a dingy toy, car, or other objects. Before they can read and before they can actually read a book, they can play with it, manipulate it, and they can learn that in this book there is this button, and on the other hand there is a buttonhole. So the buttonhole can be made to match together. So you see all these wonderful objects in kindergarten, in parents' home, in schools. There are surprises everywhere. But people have to be curious. And as I said, it's a bit like indoctrinating a child with a book. And then when they're adults, when they've been properly indoctrinated, they buy books when they grow up. But then we break and we tear up the book. Look, this is a book that Munari drew in the 90s along with Verrière. And it's called the book that turns into a bed and that has been read. And there is a play on the words here in Italian. So it's 1 meter, over 1 meter. There are clasps on the side, so that the kid can close it and open it again, so that they have a big book to read with the stories that unfold as the book is unfolded. But when you open 2 pages of the book, At that point, you have a book that measures 1.6 meters by 1 meter. It's not easy, but Munari is always doing things which are difficult and is always thinking outside the box. And then here is Pietro Munari continuing with his rather unusual books. You see, paper is not used as a medium, as a vehicle, not as a tool to place content on, but Munari began creating books. The yellow Riding Hood, the white Riding Hood, the green Riding Hood. You all understood that it's a revision of the Red Riding Hood. Yellow Riding Hood uses photocopies. Here we have the matrix, and we start unrolling it. And then you see, as in all the games we played when we had a photocopier, you see what you get, completely different things. And it does start the year after the invention of the photocopier. You can imagine that the owners of Xerox in Milan were delighted to see that we were going to make the printer understand right away how to make mistakes. This is Green Riding Hood. Look, it's the repetition of sheets with a whole series of jumps. But what's important in the context of the story I'm pursuing is White Riding Hood. And in fact, I'm going to read some pages. And they're dedicated to John Cage. I've never seen that much snow. This morning, we woke up and we opened the window. We were blinded by so much white. The snow had fallen all night and covered everything around us. I've never seen so much snow. So there you go. You can imagine the rest. And then at a certain point, when someone starts to have doubt, you can see the two eyes of White Riding Hood staring at you right in the eyes. And then you realize that everything Munari writes is not making fun of us, but the child understands that immediately. He has no difficulty understanding it. And we say, come on, this book was very expensive, and there is nothing in it. So, but this is Munari's style, his desire to use the medium as an element for storytelling. And in the end, it's the thread that runs through the Italian design in the 50s. Form, function, materials, content, everything goes in the same direction. That's in the dark of the night. And unlike White Riding Hood, that's Munari's first commercial book that Munari launched using his tested technique. And here he tells the story of the night, not so much through a story or through drawings or other narrative escapes, but by using the medium of paper and black paper. In the darkness of the night, no need to add anything. We are right in the middle, at the heart of the night, as we read. And look, there is this yellow dot in the distance. And this is a hole. And page after page, the hole becomes smaller. So me, in my night, in the obscurity of my night, I get close, because there is the thickness of the paper. So this hole of a certain diameter becomes smaller and smaller. And 16 pages later, I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to give it to you. But the paper changes and the environment changes. And here we have paper telling us this new context. So it's paper as used by architects sometimes when they draw on their blueprints, and this paper gives us the idea of fog, of smog, of walking through field covered with the fog, and we see where he wants to take us. And that's fascinating because with all these transparent papers and layers and tracing papers, we see what's going on. I can't see very clearly what's 3 pages further on because there is tracing paper. But as I turn the pages, I get closer to the contours, but also from the drawn object. And if I look on this side, you see that what I saw very clearly 3 pages back, well, all this is quite blurry. So if I go in one direction in my reading, then what's blurry and what's clear changes meaning. And when Munari does that, he does that with this wonderful trick, this wonderful invention. He uses paper and the page not as a graphic space, but as a physical space. So it's a bit behind the scene that allows to see both sides. So we are behind the scenes of the book. And then the same goes for another book that he drew shortly afterwards, called Black Night. No, sorry. In the fog of Milano. So we're walking through the streets of Milano. Milano plunged in the fog, in the mist, and you can see here this colored circus. And here you see we are faced with a total genius in storytelling. This book is printed in black only. It's only the paper that's in color. So here too, in the end, there are the very things he wants to do because he knows all the production and realization techniques. And in the end, that's why he uses these brilliant ideas. So obviously, for the publishing house, it's not great because it would be much easier to print everything in color now. But at the time, it wasn't all that simple. So this idea of going backstage is something that Munari is familiar with. He knows that because when he had to celebrate and organize the 50th anniversary for the printing of this book, he decided to tell the story by constructing this sort of backstage area with fog, mist, and people could actually move from one place to another. I'm going to circulate it so that you can discover it. But before all this, and let me take a step back, in 1945, I really wanted to tell you this. Yesterday, as you know, it was a Liberation Day in Italy, 25th of April, and for the Italians it's a very important date. On 25th of April 1945, that was the end of World War II for the Italians. The Allies entered Milan and liberated the city. The city of Milan, where there was a publishing house, Mondadori, quite different from the one we know today, and which in 1945 published this collection of books. Imagine Milan under the bombs with tanks driving through the city, and Mondadori printing books for Bruno Munari. That's to give you an idea of context. So it's a bit incredible. In extremely difficult conditions, the end of the war, fightings in Milan, bombs on Milan, and Milan was publishing books. And Mondadori published a whole collection of books called the textbooks, and in these books they state that Munari says, I don't like children's book. And his little boy was old enough to start reading at that time, and he started thinking about the books that his kid could be able to read. But Munari was loved revolutionizing things. Toc, toc, knock, knock, who is there? Open the door, and you can see that there are things happening here. You know, paper is no longer a medium as such, and this page is transforming. It becomes a door. There is no door that's drawn on this cover page, but it's the cover page which is the door, and that makes a difference. And when you open it, you can see the giraffe, this famous giraffe called Lucia. And then you can see that there are some boxes, so you try and open to see what's in the box. So I open to try and see what's in the box, and this is where you see that this is an interactive book. So I open the book. And remember, we are in 1945, by the way, and Milan was being bombed. And it's important when you see a book with a book with pages that open, that are interactive, etc. And all this is posterior to 1945, and there is a whole series of experiments that date back to Russian constructivism. But in the end, who was the initiator of this idea? Well, it was Bruno, Munari. And then there is Carmela the zebra, and then there is Ottavio the lion, and then if you open the suitcase again, there is a small package, and then in the package there is a basket with Alphonse in the basket, and in the little basket it seems that there is a grasshopper called Cirillo, and then there is an ant, and it's always the way, there is an ant. When you search, when you go really in the belly of the book, after an extremely perilous journey, you return to everyday life. Shoe with no lace, an ant, a crumb of paper. So you go back to the fascination of what small and small objects.
Oh la 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 la.
No, 6.
Oh dear, no, just give me 6 minutes, please.
Questo è un altro
Look,
prestigiatore
that's
giallo che insomma
book.
è un po'
That's the
è
Yellow
un po' in quella
Wizard.
direzione.
The Yellow
Queste sono
Wizard,
le
well, we're still in the
edizioni,
same vein
edizioni
here.
originali
Look,
che
there
venivano
you have
fatte. Noi abbiamo
the
recentemente fatto
original
una serie di
editions.
mostre e di
Very
racconti,
recently, we
perché appunto,
organized a
essendo
series of
80 anni fa
exhibitions,
accadeva
since
in un
all of
periodo in
this
cui volevamo
happened
celebrarlo,
80
abbiamo
years ago,
creato questa
and we wanted to
piccola,
celebrate the
questa piccola
anniversary.
esposizione dove
So
in
that's why
realtà
we
ci sono
put
una
together
serie di
this
libri
exhibition
ingranditi dove
where
ci si può entrare
there
dentro.
were a whole
E
series
quindi
of
si ritorna
enlarged
un po'
books
all'idea di
that
spazio,
in which you could
che
walk,
avevamo prima, che
into
volevamo
which you could walk,
raccontare
you
prima.
could get
L'ultimo
inside the
libro che
books,
a
and
questo
so
punto, avendo solo
we come back to
fatto
my initial idea of space. I started with
volevo
space, and
farvi
since
vedere
I only have 4
questo
minutes
libro
left,
di
I'm
una
going to
giovane
show you
illustratrice,
the last
quando
book,
ci ha lavorato
unfortunately. Well, I really want to show you
che,
this
ci
one.
ha
She's
portato
a young
questo libro,
illustrator,
che era
Susie
la sua
Lee. She
tesi di
won a
laurea
prize for
e che abbiamo
children's
pubblicato
literature,
così com'era.
and it was her
Quindi,
thesis
quando
at the
cercate
time. We
l'editore
published
Classe
it
Libertà,
as
particolare,
it was in its original form. When you can find a publisher who gives you so much leeway, you can still find them. I don't know if there are any left, but
molto semplice,
look, it's a very
fotografico, in
simple, basic
cui,
story
in cui
with
si parla,
pictures.
Di questa Alice. Ci sono una serie di
And
scene
here you see
in
we're
cui
talking about Alice in Wonderland.
Alice
So
entra
Alice in
nel-
Wonderland, as
noi entriamo nel libro, iniziamo a vedere
as she
un
sees
piccolo
things, you
spettacolo
enter the
che,
book, you see
che
this
si sta
sort of
svolgendo
party, there's a show going on,
all'interno di un
and
teatro, e poi
it's
dopo la
taking place in a
telecamera,
theater.
ci fosse la telecamera che
And
gira
then, as if the camera was zooming in,
inizia
a sort
lo
of
spettacolo,
close-up
iniziano a
shot,
scomparire
and
le
the
quinte.
camera
Oltre a scomparire le
enters
quinte,
the
succede
theater,
un'altra cosa che
and
secondo me
we
è molto
discover
interessante,
the
che non si
backstage
vede,
area.
è lì in
So
piccoli
we
film.
go behind
Che è
the
che,
scenes.
il
There's something
bordo
else
della,
very
della
interesting that we
fotografia
can discover, and you can
diminuisce
see
pian
here
piano.
you're
Ogni
really
pagina che
tiptoeing
passa,
in,
questo
and the
piccola
outline of the
cornice
picture is gradually
quindi succede
shrinking.
quello che dicevamo prima
Every
di
time
Munari.
you turn a
Non è più
page, you can see
un'immagine
that the
sopra una
frame is
pagina, ma
getting
è
smaller,
quella
and that's
pagina
what
che
we
diventa una
said
cosa
when
si
with
trasforma,
Bruno
diventa uno
Munari. It's
spazio,
not
diventa uno spazio
image that's on the page. It's the page that changes its nature. The page undergoes a transformation. It becomes a frame, it becomes a space. And look at all of these images. They speak of involvement. They absorb us, they draw us into the book. And then finally, something that seemed a truism, something obvious. Look at the sheet on the left here, the page that has never been used. It happens ever so simply. You switch from the right page to the left. You're really immersed in the book, completely immersed into it. And then the show ends at one point, Alice in Wonderland, the end. The usual thank yous, naturally, the greetings, the bowing. So I think every graphic designer should look at this gesture. And then the lights come back on, the spotlights come back on, and that's it. You can imagine, you can't see anything, but you can imagine the lights coming back on, the audience leaving the theater, and you realize that the theater wasn't a real theater, it was a miniature theater, it was a small theater. So you leave the theater, you leave the story, you leave Alice, and then with a flick of the finger, look at that little finger, as when you hear the noise in a cinema, you realize that you're not in the city where the film is being shown, you are in the film. Well, here, that little finger finally expels you from the book, takes you out of the book, and at that point you see the book in a different light. So I wanted to show you plenty of other books. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to do so. So here, a very important book by Marshall and McLuhan called The Medium is the Message, in which it tells us that books allow us to see far beyond content, far beyond a medium, and far beyond where we are. So, we have the good fortune of welcoming Denis Brunat, a fashion and garment historian and also curator at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, known as the MAD. Denis has delighted us with his writings and the quality of the exhibitions he has curated, the quality of the scenographers he has chosen. I could go on, but the question I really want to ask you today, dear Denis, is can we wear paper? Can we get dressed in paper? Well, first of all, I would like to thank Constance and Hugues for inviting me. I have to say it, I'm a little nervous because there have been some great paper experts here, which is not my case. I work on fashion phenomena, clothing and textile, and I'm going to focus here on a few aspects of my research project on paper clothing and dressing in paper. So paper and garments, or more generally, paper and fashion are closely intertwined, even today, despite new technologies such as computers, digital tools, which are ever so present. You have to bear in mind that paper, the sheet of paper, the sketchbook, well, they are still present. In the initial stage of creation, you know the importance of drawing for the great couturiers, such as Yves Saint Laurent, Karl Lagerfeld. But you have to bear in mind that paper is still very much present today. So paper is also used to make patterns, even though electronics has taken over. And even in 3D creation, we moving on to the 3D stage, but in fashion, it has to be said that paper is still very important in the initial stage. So in fashion, look at the packaging boxes, the chic branded bags. They are almost always made of paper, despite the widespread use of organic cotton tote bags. But we can see that the more chic a brand wants to be, the more it uses paper packaging. Well, nowadays, if we look at the place and role of paper clothing, these are garments that don't last very long, like the overalls you can use for work, paper overalls. Here you have the paper pajamas that can be given to patients in hospitals. That's in the middle. And on the right, you have the scrubs worn by medical staff. So some of these disposables are single-use. they're still made of paper. And paper is also important because there was, I would say, since the 19th century, the arrival of what has been called tissue paper. And tissue paper appeared in the 19th century. Here, more recently on the right, you see an advertisement for the brand Sopalin, in particular what we call paper towels in France, or tissue paper. And you also have a guide for the good housewife in 1951 here on the slide. And then the paper handkerchief has a long history. It really spread in France, in Western Europe in the 60s, 70s. But we can find paper handkerchiefs in the mid-19th century, and it's true that we don't dress in handkerchiefs, but when you are a curator in the fashion department of an institution, handkerchiefs like paper fans are very much part of what we call fashion accessories. Paper is also very much used for fancy dress, crepe paper. Hugues was convinced that I was the little boy that you could see on the slide just there. But I have to say that I have to make it clear it's not me. And you can dress it up in paper too. Here you have the famous paper dolls that still exist. You have models here from 1860, 1920 and 2015. Which is interesting is that paper and fabric share vocabulary. Paper, like fabric, can be cut, creased, folded, and torn. You can print on both paper and fabric. A piece of cloth, like a sheet of paper, is a flat surface that invites creative expression. This brings to mind the song Laissez parler les petits papiers by Gainsbourg, which was sung by Régine, whom we'll talk about a little later. So, in English, we could say it means let the small pieces of paper do the talking. So why share these words? Because there's one essential thing, and that's the chemical composition of both paper and fabric. Paper like cotton and linen are all made from cellulose, and it's probably for this reason that we've made fabrics out of paper and paper out of fabric. For the long tradition that exists, which takes us to the Far East, that is, of course, China, and the Chinese were undoubtedly the first to use paper to make clothes out of it as early as the 2nd century AD, tradition that spread to Japan, if I'm not mistaken, as early as the 10th century. Japanese Buddhist monks began to create paper garments from their sutra, meaning their book of prayers. And paper clothes were made in Japan for almost all classes of society, farmers, the upper classes as well. And paper garments were brought to Japan for several reasons. Religious ones, for reasons of necessity, I would say, because paper is always cheaper than fabric, and also for aesthetic reasons. It was mainly during the Edo period, from the 17th until the middle of the 19th century, that the most paper garments were made using washi paper. And this famous paper was used to make screens, doors, and lamps, but also for garments. I'm showing you a magnificent garment here that is kept in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which dates from the 19th century. It's entirely made of paper. It is notably soaked in persimmon juice to make it a little stiffer and waterproof, and the darker parts that you see on the garment are precisely silk inserts that come in at the end to give a decorative effect, but also to strengthen it, strengthen the garment. Because the problem with paper garments, we ask ourselves whether it's going to be resistant and waterproof as well, because that's very important. So I don't have the time to dwell on Asia. Let's take a look at what's happening in Western culture. The first thing about Western culture is that paper was often used as a reinforcement. I think paper was used, which in the text from the 16th century onwards was called carte, card, and this was often hidden between the fabric on top and the lining, which is of course underneath. So this paper will be used to reinforce, stiffen, verticalize a garment. Before paper, parchment was used, and here I am showing you, for example, a mitre, a bishop's headdress, not just any bishop's headdress, since this is the headdress of the Blessed Guala, who was Bishop of Brescia in Italy in the 13th century. It is in the collections of the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. I took it apart carefully, and I found, very fortunately, a parchment from the 13th century inside. So we recovered an old papal bow from Clement IV. So once paper became widespread, it of course supplanted parchment. And even today, if you go for a walk near the Panthéon neighborhood in Paris, in the 5th district, if you want to dress up as a bishop, you can see that those mitre headdresses are reinforced with paper. So in addition to those, you also have the false colors dating from the end of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century. So why these false colors? They are made of papier mâché. They are covered with a silk fabric. They were put around the neck, not to look pretty, but to be able to put the large ruffs that were getting bigger and bigger in 1590s, 1610s. So they needed some support, otherwise those ruffs would fall off. So you really need something that resembles a big wafer, I would say, and these are indeed made of paper. Something else, the paper in these aristocratic garments from the very beginning of the 17th century is what we call doublets. So the top garments, as you can see, the men are wearing a garment that is very rigid, and this is the very principle of aristocratic clothing. The stiffer the garment, the more uncomfortable it is, and it shows that the wearer is doing nothing. And to show that the garment is an armor that prevents you from doing the simplest things in everyday life, it's reinforced with whalebone, with canvas glued with a kind of glue, and also with paper. And this is what you can see in the belly area. So we know this because when you take things apart, sometimes during restoration work, we can find cardboard. And when you read tailors' manuals, handbooks from that period, or in bookkeeping, which are very valuable when the garments have not been preserved. So, for example, in 1625, in the bookkeeping of the Dukes of Lorraine, we know that they wanted to make a pourpoint for the Duke, and they said, we need a piece of canvas and a sheet of paper. And this clearly shows that paper was used to make these garments.
The second major point that shows that paper is used in Western culture for clothes making is that paper is a substitute material. Paper replaces fabric or traditional clothing materials. For example, at the beginning of the 19th century, you can see that on this small woman's hat. The most traditional bonnets were made in straw, but this is UK, and the best straw were coming from Italy. But there were the Napoleonic Wars that prevented straw from coming from Italy to go to the UK because they had to travel through France. So in order to replace these straws that no longer came to England, bonnets were made from embossed paper, which, as you can see, imitate the plating pattern of the straw. It was often during the wars that paper took precedence over fabric. For example, during the First World War, paper clothing was also manufactured for economic reasons and for patriotic reasons. For instance, there were textile shortages, which encouraged the manufacture of paper corsets for women made with paper. And here you have this replacement corset, which was produced either in Germany or in Austria, made from paper twine fabric with paper twine laces, but metal stays. And because fabric became extremely expensive, and also because these products often come from workshops in Paris, but Paris and Germany were at war, and it was frowned upon, and German and Austrian women were encouraged not to buy French products. So as a result, paper was in short supply. It was impossible to buy French products, so most products were made locally, but precisely with paper. And we have several texts. For instance, an English newspaper wrote in November 1915, paper dresses and suits were sold in huge quantities in Berlin. They're warm and they also provide remarkable protection against the rain. Another thing, quite amusing, that's still Germany and Austria at the end of the war, and this man who could not afford a cloth suit had a three-piece suit made with a top hat with postmarked envelopes. And to the right you have samples of paper tissue, paper cloth that were offered in a Vienna department store in Austria. You can also dress in paper, both on the streets but also for eternity. As in Germany and Austria, they tried to make paper clothes for the dead. Cloth was so expensive that they were not going to waste it on someone who would take it for eternity. So several companies tried to make complete garments made of paper for the dead. It's all the easier because it's extremely difficult to dress a dead person in real clothes. So paper for economic reasons, because traditional cloth is expensive. And we have an excerpt from a newspaper called L'Éco-Janté, and this is in 1920, and it says that the Americans, and I quote, "The Americans had the idea of dressing cheaply while waiting for the price of wool to go down. So they thought of paper suits that the Germans wore during the war, and of which it seemed there are still large stocks in Germany." End of quote. And this was back in 1920. So when we talk about shortages of clothes and raw materials for making clothes, of course we have to talk about World War II. We used lots of things, cork and wood to make shoes, and paper was not used as much, but there are traces of it, more specifically to make hats, women's hats. For instance, there was a Parisian hat maker, Rose Valois, and she made hats in 1942. And here is a piece of article. Rose Valois made a hat in blotting paper, so fresh, so tender, so delicate. And Gérard Albuy made several models of hats in newspaper. And to the left, for instance, you can see a double-page article in the 1941 issue of Marie Claire. And to the right, you have another model, again, in 1941, in art and fashion. And then at Musée des Arts Décoratifs, we are very lucky. We have a very fine example of a hat by Gérard Albuy, which is entirely made of cardboard and newspaper. And another point this time, when real paper clothes were made. And this is where you can find traces in texts as early as the 16th century. One of the oldest examples I came across was that of painter Jean de Maubeuge. And we still have several works that he made. He had two passions, painting and wine. And he was at the service of Marquis de Verrière. And Marquis de Verrière had to receive and house Charles V. So he gave money to all members of his staff to go and buy white damask to make a beautiful suit. But Jean Mabuse kept the money and went to buy wine bottles that he drank and got drunk. And when the time comes, he doesn't have any damask clothes. But he's a painter, so he makes a paper dress. He replaced it with a white paper dress that he painted in damask with large flowers. The brilliance of the colors made the painter's dress stand out, and the emperor was surprised by the brilliance of this dress, asked him to come closer, and discovered his ruse. Everybody laughed about it. There is evidence of paper that can be found in more ancient times, more specifically in the theatre. There is a little play published in 1719, performed by Italian actors, and it's the story of the goddess of fashion. And the goddess of fashion is dressed in a paper suit. And she has a conversation with Miss Mousseline, who is a linen maid in Paris at the palace. And Miss Mousseline says, "The ladies found paper clothes to their liking last summer, and for their convenience, I had shirts made of the same material." And the palace secretary said, "Convenience? Yeah, so you shouldn't get them wet." End of quote. And that was back in 1719. And I think that the theatre costumes are not without reminding us, for instance, of the images of trades that flourished in the 17th and 18th centuries, like this engraving by Martin Engelbrecht in 1735, which shows the bookbinder totally dressed in books and papers. So, at the beginning of the 19th century, with a great boom in paper ties and shirt collars, we imported a lot of these pieces of garment. And here we can read the many treatises on neckties. For instance, the Necktie Code that was published in 1828. And we learn that there was an innovation that came from actors in France, from some artists who didn't have enough money to buy collars and ties made of cloth, and who replaced these fashion accessories with paper collars and ties. However, the Necktie Code, published in 1828, tells us that this paper replaces the finest fabrics from Brussels and England. And then we learned that a famous Parisian bookseller once took it upon himself to show up wearing a paper collar while out walking and socializing in the most glamorous salons of Paris. It caused quite a stir. What's interesting is that in the same year, 1828, this fashion was echoed in the theatre. There was a vaudeville called the Confiseur Dramatique, the dramatic confectioner, set in a confectionery shop, in which the confectioner summoned the paper maker because he wanted to place orders for wrapping paper to cover his sweets. The paper maker arrives with his two children, and the children and the paper maker are all dressed in paper from head to toe. And the paper maker, well, the confectioner says, "I need paper," etc. And the paper maker says, "I haven't got paper anymore because now I sell linen." And he says, "Up until now, we've made paper out of linen. Now we make linen out of paper." And that was in 1928. A surprising example, for which I have no more information, is this bodice from 1868, which was entirely made from sheets of newspaper, the Philadelphia newspaper. The lining is in cotton, but the whole front is cut from several pages of this issue of the newspaper of 9 September 1868. From there, of course, we could epilogue with a newsprint motif printed on fabric, dating from exactly the same time. But it's true that we're much more familiar with examples of articles made by Elsa Schiaparelli in the 1930s, which were then taken up by a generation of designers, including John Galliano. And then, of course, there was the great turning point of the 1960s. And that's important because in the 1960s, paper went from being a simple substitution material to becoming a fashion trend. And it's really The great era of paper clothing, short one because it lasted from 1966 to 1968, but it was an essential period. First, because the 60s marked a turning point in the history of fashion. It was a time of a new generation, baby boomers who wanted to break with the past. They no longer wanted to dress like the previous generation. Men no longer wanted to wear their father's clothes. They wanted a sweatshirt, a t-shirt, blue jeans and trainers. Women no longer wanted to wear their long pleated skirts. This was really the era of the mini dress or mini skirt. It was also a time when fashion designers and manufacturers explored the creative and commercial potential of materials that were truly unconventional. Of course, in this era, we'll see a few examples by Paco Rabanne, who used metal, plastic, glass and paper to make dresses. So it was probably the Americans and then the British who started making paper clothes, and it's probably the Scott Paper Company in the US that created a whole range of dresses in as early as 1966. So you have this short dresses, very much in the spirit of the time. But what's interesting is that at the very beginning, this company wanted to make a garment that was humorous, very much in the spirit of the time. But they were very surprised when they received more than 500,000 orders in less than 1 year. So, of course, they wanted to capitalize on this craze, and all sorts of dresses came out of their workshops with psychedelic motifs printed over and over again, totally typical of the pop art movement. So here's some more that were produced between 1966 and 1968. And of course, when we talk about pop art in fashion, we can't help but mention this dress with the Campbell soup that was created by Andy Warhol. Originally, it was a dress that was created to promote the soup. And as a matter of fact, many of these paper dresses were often given as gifts when you offered the cans of soup. Another advertising product was used to tell the merits of a candidate to the presidential election, Nixon, which helped electing the president that year. So in 1968, he became president. We talked about the Scott Paper Company, but many other companies started making paper clothes between 1966 and 1968. There were some in the US, others in the UK. And in the UK, by the way, in 1966, there were several brands. And in the Draper's Record, an English magazine devoted to drapery and clothing, you can read that the Occitan, called the Kings of Kings Road, that had launched the first British range of disposable dresses and had collaborated with Celia Birtwell to create the printed patterns that you can see on the dress. And we know that the wholesale price for merchants was 15 shillings, so something that was very cheap at the time. So, Paco Rabanne. Let's come back to France. Paco Rabanne started working with paper to make clothes as early as 1967. And I found a French news program dated January 3rd, 1967, which specifically mentioned the ephemeral fashion of paper dresses that they call disposable dresses. The commentator says it's an aberration that consists of dressing in 100 packets like wafers and chocolate in metallic paper. End of quote. And you can see here a model walking around in a dress made of metallic paper. The commentator continues, it's the death of the sewing machine, hems, seams, everything is glued. And further on, Paco Rabanne appears in his workshop making a paper dress for singer Helga Anderson, and he shows precisely how his dress can tear. And then the story goes, the German actress made a trip in the boot of her car so as not to crease and tear her dress in order to go and meet Regine for a Parisian party that was typical of the late 1960s. The comment says that if the dress tears, doesn't matter, it can be glued back, and that would only cost 1 franc. We know that Paco Rabanne also made paper dresses on a larger scale, which he had manufactured in Roanne by the Annick Roblin company. And it was a great success because delivery times were expanded. And in Le Monde, on March 1967, an article said that a new 2,400 square meter factory was being built. And I can show you here some pictures of Paco Rabanne's dress that could then be customized the way you wanted, with colored tapes, felt pens, and paint. And there was a record that was recorded called the Papivores, and it says, in a paper dress, I ate it in this beautiful pleated paper. And the president of a nightclub in 1960 remembered these dresses and says they were very fragile and did not resist for long. And very soon the girls ended up in their knickers, which the boys quite enjoyed. And when they bought 3 dresses, we offered them color tape so that they can stick their dresses back together again. Moving in the 90s, and that's going to be the end, with the new links between fashion and art and the importance of concept in art, in fashion creation, and paper comes back after 30 years where it almost disappeared. So in a chronology that shows creators in various universes, you have Lang that used papers which were not very conventional. And here in 1991, these were paper dresses that were throwable, supposed to be throwable, and it's quite revealing of his minimalist and simplistic work, as opposed to his work. Here is an example of Christian Lacroix's work. Lacroix is the couturier of history by excellence. And here, this is a dress made of craft paper that was initially glued. And this is a dress that was created for a picture report, and the dress was not supposed to last long. Another example here, James Rosenke, a figure in American pop art that dates back to 1950. And in 1998, he designed this paper suit that was produced at 100 copies by Hugo Boss for an exhibition that was organized in Berlin in the Guggenheim Center. And this suit is extremely interesting because it's a reflection on an opposition between what lasts and what vanishes. It lasts because that's a male suit of 1998, and then with no change in the shape, you move from this model of the male suit that was designed 100 years before. So beyond the sustainable and lasting shape of the suit, you have the very ephemeral nature of the material it's made from. And I will finish with one fashion creator, which is probably one of the most conceptual, that's Hussein Chalayan. That's 1999. he designed an envelope, which is a paper dress. And the envelope was sent from London to the Parisian address. And when you unfold the envelope, you get a short tunic dress, which is the prototype of what Chalayan called the airmail clothing in 1999. The idea being to merge two objectives, the letter that you want to mail and the dress that you unfold and that you can then wear. Thank you. Thank you. We are going to pack now, and we will meet again on June 14th at Bouffe du Nord Theatre for the last session in the series of conferences dedicated to paper. Enjoy your weekend and see you soon.